Welcome to Chatter. I'm David Priest, publisher of Lawfare. This week, John Dickey on Freemasonry and Conspiracism.
Let's take one of those figures, George Washington. He was a Freemason. He was initiated, actually, I think before he was of age, because it was part of a gentleman's status. Freemasonry is very, very deeply ingrained in American society. This is why Buzz Aldrin founds a Masonic lodge on the moon. The French Revolution was calamitous, a catastrophe for conservative Catholic Europe. And in the desperation to find an explanation, an exiled former Jesuit priest came up with an answer. And the answer was that the French Revolution was all the result of a conspiracy by the Freemasons.
John Dickey, welcome to Chatter.
Well, thank you for inviting me on. I'm really looking forward to our discussion.
I first came across your name and your work many years ago now when I was researching some organized crime issues. And I, of course, found your work, which you have been very well involved over the years in research, in particular on Italian organized crime, which does make me wonder, how does one get to that as a career? How did you find yourself so interested in Italian history and in particular the organized crime networks?
Well, one chapter of my PhD, I mean, it was a strictly academic route, if you like. My PhD included a chapter on the earliest sociological investigation into the Sicilian mafia in the mid-1870s by a guy called Leopoldo Franchetti. So I knew about the sort of revolution in historical thinking that had gone on in Italy and Sicily in particular about the Sicilian mafia, not just historical thinking, but historical thinking, if you like, following on from a revolution in judicial and investigative thinking. And it seemed to me that the rest of the world simply hadn't caught up. You know, in the reflex way to talk about organized crime in Italy was as a sort of primitive preamble to the American story. You know, a story of, but very much told in the same sort of plaintive key as the Godfather movies, certainly Godfather 2. As a story of sort of families and primitive violence and vengeance and so on and so forth. When actually we now know that the Sicilian Mafia was a self-conscious criminal organization before it went to America, that it's very much a manifestation of modernity. It's not to do with families or anything like that. It grew up in the most advanced sector of the Sicilian economy, that is the citrus fruit sector on the outskirts of Palermo, round and about Palermo, where lemons, you know, Sicily at that point had a virtual natural monopoly of lemons, which were exported to the New World. And before too long, gangsters traveled with those lemons, and that's how we got that first sort of transatlantic link. But we don't get anywhere looking at the Sicilian Mafia as something primitive or the reflection of a backward society. And that story badly needed telling, so that's why I set about telling it.
And on its surface, it would seem that researching the Sicilian Mafia or its counterparts elsewhere in Italy would be challenging. That research can go so far, but at a certain point, you have to find yourself asking questions of people who have been reticent to answer such questions in most fora. So how do you find research on some of these topics, such as organized crime, and the conversation we'll focus on most is Freemasonry, researching topics that are inherently about some some level of secret society and secret keeping when your job is to reveal many of those secrets?
Yeah, it's a very good question. You know, the Sicilian Mafia is, of course, a secret society. It makes a great play of its code of omertà, which, interestingly enough, doesn't come from manliness or any of these things. It comes from Masonic vocabulary. It means humility,
Hmm.
umiltà in Sicilian. But it is the code of silence. It's humility, of obedience to the boss. But fortunately for us, that code is absolutely full of holes. And what we find when we look at the historical records is that members of the Sicilian Mafia have always talked, have always broken omertà. You know, the first resort almost of a mafioso who is losing the fight against his internal rivals is to go to the police and to try and turn the police against them. Now, what often would then happen? So the police would dutifully record all these statements and say, well, you know, I belong to this secret society. It's called the mafia, or we call it the honored society. And you have to go through this initiation ritual. And this is how we work, you know, and this is how we're structured. And all this would go fine. And then very often it would fall apart when it came to trial, because the witnesses would be killed or would be brought back into the fold with sort of black threats or blandishments or whatever. So what you've got is a lot of evidence that may not have quite, in some cases it did stand up to trial, but then got forgotten. But in a lot of cases didn't stand up to trial, but which we can look at now with the benefit of hindsight and say, oh my goodness, you know, this really is the same organization. It's identical. It grew up in the same places. It did the same things, exactly the same business model. These guys were telling the truth and paid for it with their lives in a lot of cases. So that's the kind of material historians are working with. The mystery is not so much what the mafia was doing. The mystery is how on earth it took so long for Italy in particular to get round to seriously fighting the mafia.
Right. Well, I feel like we literally could talk all day about that topic, but I actually have been interested in talking to you for several weeks now after seeing some news related to Freemasonry, because you have also written what I consider the definitive work on the topic called The Craft. And it wasn't that long ago. I think we're going back to the end of March when I came across an outburst from the Great Master of the Grand Lodge of Russia, who issued a statement to, presumably, to not just Russian brothers, but also those in Ukraine, saying that everyone should be faithful to their obligations, to have a strict ban on discussions about political and religious issues in our lodges. We must avoid fraternal strife. Please refrain from discussing political realities, not only within the walls of the temples, but also in profane debates, including social networks. Be faithful to your oath to the motherland. And it wasn't long after that the Grand Master of the Great Lodge in Ukraine pointed out that this was a real problem. There is no mutual recognition any longer between the Grand Lodges in Ukraine and in Russia. And it had become a casualty, perhaps, or maybe a reflection of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And at the same time, anytime you have any world historical event, you will start getting the conspiracy theories. So you've had, I think in years past, you've had some of the pro-Russian separatists in Donetsk and eastern Ukraine blaming any conflict on US and European Masons. And you don't have to dig far into the more radical parts of the internet to find claims that Russia invading Ukraine is simply a Freemason hoax, or alternatively, that it's a problem of the West conspiring against a Freemason activity of some a lot of numerology and things like that. So when I started to see that, John, I thought, I really need to talk to you because Freemasonry perhaps is one of the most deliberately misunderstood organizations in history. But there is such a rich and interesting history there that understanding it better helps us put these kinds of claims into perspective. So I'd really like to start with your overall impression of Freemasonry, having dipped into it extensively for years. You find that the secrets that are supposedly part of Freemasonry are actually less important than the stories about the secrecy. Can you talk through that a bit?
Yeah, I'm glad you wanted to begin with secrecy. That story, the Russia-Ukraine thing, is in a sense in microcosm the kind of thing that's been going on all the way through the history of Freemasonry. Freemasons have a ban on discussing politics and religion in lodge meetings. But the problem is, of course, who gets to decide where politics begins and ends. And clearly, Russian Freemasons and Ukrainian Freemasons have a very different view on that. And that story is repeated right through Masonic history. It's one of those rough edges where Freemasonry's admirable code of universal values rubs up against the reality of the world, of society. And it's those rough edges that I'm interested in my book. But let's start with secrecy. Because, when I first started investigating this, I was talking to the head of communications at the United Grand Lodge of England. I said, well, you're a secret society, aren't you? And he said, no. We're not, definitely not a secret society. We're a society with secrets. Now, that is a pretty invisible distinction to anyone with a kind of a suspicious cast of mind. You always think, well, you see, they've clearly got something hidden in the folds of their cloak somewhere. But we need to really dive in and understand what Masonic secrecy is, because it is an inevitable part of Masonic secrecy. One would almost say it's part of what it's intended to do, that it creates both a sense of loyalty and mystique around the Freemasons. People join because they want to be the possessors of secrets. People are attracted, they're made curious about the Freemasons by this secrecy. And by the same token, people are made suspicious of Freemasonry. What have they got to hide, is the refrain. So let's look at this head on. Okay, Masonic secrecy takes place, is staged in a kind of ritual context. To become a Freemason, you go through three key rituals, three basic important rituals. They become a full Freemason in the full sense. And in each of those rituals, there's a sort of, there are triple layers of secrecy. On the one hand, the meeting itself is secret. It takes part in a secluded location behind the closed, guarded doors of a lodge.
Mm-hmm.
On the second thing, the things that you learn in the ritual are themselves disguised behind symbols of various kinds, the most famous one being the square and compass, but also everything is symbolic in Freemasonry, the aprons, the gloves, you name it. And then, of course, you have to take an absolutely blood-curdling oath to swear. You swear to protect the secrets. There's various forms in the different rituals, kind of throat cutting and disemboweling and all sorts of horrors, which would make you think, geez, these Masonic secrets must be something extremely momentous. but because I'm not a Freemason, I can tell you what those secrets are. And I'm not really giving away any secrets because they haven't been secret since at least 1730, when the first expose of Freemasonry was published. So that's before Freemasonry arrived in the United States, then the American colonies. Secret number one that you learn in the first ritual is that you should really try to be a nice chap. Secret number two.
Quite a secret there.
Secret number two is that you learn in the second ritual is that you should try and find out a bit more about the world. And secret number three, which is the most momentous secret of all, the one that takes part in the most elaborate ritual, the Master Mason ritual, you learn that death is quite a serious business and ought to make us reflect on things. That's the third secret. So these secrets are toweringly banal. Nobody can disagree with them. Nobody could disagree with them. And what we're left to explain, therefore, is the colossal disproportion between the ritual and the palaver, to put it bluntly, that surrounds the rituals, the theatre, the moral theatre that surrounds these secrets and the secrets themselves. And the first is that we have to understand these rituals are really powerful. They work. They're well designed, emotionally powerful. Again and again and again, people, tell me when I ask them what it's like to become a Freemason, it really does feel like the birth of a new self when it works well.
They describe it almost like a religious experience.
Yes,
is that right?
well, Freemasons will sort of bridle if you say you're a religion, aren't you? They'll say, no, we're not, because we don't have any theology. We don't have, you can be a Freemason as long as you believe in God. Any religion, and you can become a Freemason. In some countries, you don't even have to believe in God. In France, for example, atheists can be admitted. I like to think that they're a sort of a second order religion, in that their rituals bring the same sense of fellowship and togetherness that religion does. The Latin word religion, religio, is about binding people together. It has the same sense of sacredness, the same ethical content about trying to collectively become a better person. And above all, Freemasonry really deals with death a lot. Death is at the center of Masonic ritual. And like the great philosopher Bertrand Russell said, the business of all major world religions is dealing with the fear of death. And Freemasonry does that. So in that sense, I think it can be compared to a religion. Like I say, I call it a kind of second order religion. And there's an undoubted power and dignity and seriousness in those rituals. People who aren't familiar with Masonic rituals, like to laugh at all the trouser leg raising and chest baring and all of that sort of stuff that goes on. Any religious ritual looks weird if you're not familiar with it. And I think it takes a little bit of imaginative generosity to understand how these can be very powerful.
The oddity for me, John, starting out probably as a teenager, reading some book and reading about Freemasonry and these rituals, and maybe it's a function of childhood, maybe it's just upon learning anything new, but I immediately want to know the origin story. And correct me anywhere in here that I'm wrong, but my understanding is that the stone laying, the masonry part of it, is epiphenomenal now to other than the symbolism, to Freemasonry, that originally, because medieval stonemasons were actually bad at forming guilds, eventually in Scotland, I believe, that people got together, started forming lodges, and the term actually came from those who worked in freestone, the fine-grained sandstone or limestone, cut the stone to shape. But then at some point after that in England, there started becoming what were called accepted Masons, which is people included into these Mason guilds who did not have to be Masons. They just had to be of high standing, and then they were accepted into this fellowship. Am I right in general terms about that origin and how non-Masons came to be part of Freemasonry and eventually, obviously, the quite dominant part of Freemasonry?
Yeah, I mean, it broadly speaking, that's right. What you've got over more than a century between the Scottish capital, Edinburgh, and the English capital, London, is a slow process whereby, after an initial moment when there was a sort of meeting between the loose folklore of the elite stonemasons of Scotland and the Renaissance philosophy of the court of King James VI of Scotland, that's when you start to get the idea that what's going on in these lodges is something a bit more philosophical. That's when gentlemen who have nothing to do with being, we should really call them architects, these guys. They weren't the laborers.
Right.
This was the elite.
These weren't the people actually laying the stones. These were the people who
probably
were
not. I mean, they'd probably
designing
they'd probably work their way up from the bottom. But yeah, that's when you start to get the sense that the tools of stonemasonry have a meaning that goes far beyond their practical use. They're symbols, memorable symbols of ethical principles. And that grows until really by the early 18th century in England, the connection with, or the last connection with the elite of stonemasons is broken. And it really just becomes a gentleman's club society with, and this second order religion. But it's the context that is just as important, because going back to this issue of secrecy, the 17th and early 18th century in Britain is a time of ferocious religious conflict. The British civil wars of the middle of the 17th century tore the country apart. Religion and politics were inseparable and linked to bloody controversy and bloody dispute. So if you are trying to create this club, this society, you can't give it any, and give it that sense of sacredness. You can't give it any theological content, because that will immediately court controversy. So what do? You borrow the sacredness of religion, that sense of togetherness, the rituals and all that sort of thing for your brotherhood, but you leave out all the theological content, all the political content about freedom of speech or whatever it might be. And what you have is empty secrets that nobody can disagree with, but which are wrapped in a rather sexy package of secrecy to make them seem really interesting. So it's a very, very clever idea that allows the Masons, in a time of great religious and political controversy, to create a little local utopia of brotherhood and formal equality within the lodge.
And that does include quite a few people in the 17th and 18th century who were truly world historical figures. Christopher Wren, Sir Robert Walpole, the first British Prime Minister in the colonies, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Paul Revere, Sam Adams. Back on the continent, Goethe, you had Marquis de Lafayette. In a period of just a few decades, you had quite a few people who made quite an impact, almost as if this was the golden age of Freemasonry. We had a membership explosion in America after World War II, which we'll talk about later. But certainly in terms of the influence upon the course of modern history, it does seem like the 17th and 18th centuries were absolutely critical.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, and that's why most scholars who work on the history of Freemasonry have sort of gravitated towards the 18th century and the connection between Freemasonry and Enlightenment.
Mm-hmm.
But let's take one of those figures, George Washington. He was a Freemason. He was initiated, actually, I think before he was of age, because it was part of a gentleman's status in, colonial America. It was a way of making the right friends, showing your trustworthiness, and showing also that you were able to, in the Americas have particular importance because, their religious tolerance was key. It was part of the air that people breathe. That's why a lot of people had come to the Americas in the first place. But Washington was also a politician, and it's really after he becomes president that he sees the political uses of Freemasonry. And that's because, famously, when he became president, this was a job that he designed around himself. There was speculation at the time that he was going to make himself king. There was no real job description to being president of the United States. And it's an immense credit to him that he designed such a lasting institution. But he recognized with great foresight the weakness of the new republic. Because the lessons of history were absolutely clear, whether it be classical history or the history of the interregnum after the Civil War in Britain. Republics didn't last. Right. They collapsed into despotism or anarchy. That was just a given. And the reason was that republics couldn't have that sort of legitimating direct line descending from the Almighty to the monarch and made manifest in all kinds of ceremonies and proclamations, and the church, the throne and altar were wedded together. And the new republic didn't have that option. So Washington tried to plug some of the gap with Freemasonry. Here was something that could be a school of citizenship, of those universal values of brotherhood and tolerance and respect, and teach the skills that Americans would need for public life in discussion and mutual respect and the formal equality of all citizens, without a link to a specific religion. And as a great bonus, the Freemasons, of course, were really, really good at ceremonies. We tend to think of Freemasonry being quite secretive, but that's a relatively recent thing. These guys would be parading up and down the streets on their festival days every 6 months in full costume. They had a great range of ceremonies for commemorating the inauguration of buildings and all of that sort of thing, because, of course, they love to think of themselves as impersonating the kind of ethical values of the men who built the great cathedrals of the Middle Ages and all of that sort of thing. So that's why Washington chose to make such a huge public statement by laying the cornerstone of the Capitol building in the city that was going to bear his name, that as yet constructed Washington, D.C., that he knew was going to bear his name. And he laid a full-blown Masonic ceremony to lay the cornerstone of the Capitol building, a ceremony that would then be imitated right across the early republic. Huge hugely popular. And that's why these days, occasionally if you check on the news, people will find these foundation stones and, commemorative plaques and things like that deep under historical buildings from the very early 19th century in the United
Absolutely.
States.
And it actually builds into one of the themes I want to hit as we go through this is the conspiracy that usually later, but sometimes contemporaneously, wraps around these Masonic rituals and their influence. So in Washington, D.C., as I think in pop culture is best represented in the Dan Brown book, The Lost Symbol, there is so much made of the geometry of Washington, D.C., a planned city, that intersections echo the Masonic symbols of the compass and the square, and all of
Yeah.
the different ways that Masonic imagery is prevalent in early American history. Now, in the Lost Symbol, it actually goes in a surprisingly promising direction, which is that Freemasons are not the big bad villains conspiracy taking over the world. It's really more the setting for the book in some ways.
Yeah.
But it does lead to one of the many strands of conspiracies about Freemasonry, which is that George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, and I believe James Monroe, and a number of other prominent early American figures were all Freemasons. Therefore, and then you can go to some dark conspiracy about America. What's your experience when you look at conspiracism in the American experience of Freemasonry at this time? Of course, it expanded with things like anti-Masonic political parties within a few decades.
Yeah.
How did that evolution happen from George Washington, the most respected man, perhaps apart from Dr. Franklin, in the colonies, suddenly transitioning in the course of one person's lifetime to anti-Masonic parties and actual physical action against Masons? That seems like a sharp transition due to conspiracism.
Yeah, it's a transition that, like Freemasonry, has its origins in Europe. The Catholic Church very quickly decided it didn't like Freemasonry at all.
And what are the real
Freemasonry,
origins of that? Was it just a competing center of influence? Because honestly, John, the way you've described the precepts of Freemasonry, it is not in conflict with Catholicism. It actually supports some of the ethical precepts that the Catholic Church purportedly supports.
well, to a church that believes it holds a monopoly on truth, the idea of religious tolerance is heretical.
There is that, yes.
And of course, you have to remember that the Catholic Church in the 18th century, and indeed until 1870, was also a monarchy. It was an absolute monarchy. It owned, the Pope ruled a huge swathe of territory across central Italy, and the Pope was an absolute monarch. And so the secrecy of Freemasonry galvanized the idea that they must be up to no good, that they must be either heretics or subversives. Remember, the idea of our open society with civil society organizations and freedom of association, that doesn't exist in an absolutist state. Politics happens at the court and nowhere else. So the very existence of a society of free men like the Freemasons is looked on with huge suspicion, let alone, even before we get to the ideas of religious tolerance and secrecy and so on. So very quickly in 1738, all Freemasons are excommunicated by the Pope, and that starts a long tradition of Catholic hostility towards the Freemasons. The excommunication is still valid. It was last reiterated in the 1980s by the guy who would become Benedict XVI, the now retired Benedict XVI, when he was head of the organization that the Inquisition turned into. Right. Now, things got worse after the French Revolution. You have to imagine what a cataclysm for Catholicism the French Revolution was. Throne and altar, the two providential pillars of the earthly order of things, collapsed. Religion, the French Revolution invented the religion of the supreme being. It tried to kind of de-Catholicize. Churches were smashed up. Rouen Cathedral was turned into a gunpowder factory. This was calamitous, a catastrophe for conservative Catholic Europe. And in the desperation to find an explanation, somebody, an exiled former Jesuit priest in London who'd fled for his life to seek sanctuary in London, came up with an answer in 5 thick volumes. And the answer was that the French Revolution was all the result of a conspiracy by the Freemasons. And that book, published in 1897, was really the template for our modern conspiracy theories. If there is a sort of core form of all the many manifestations of conspiracy theories that are still with us, it's the idea that there is this secret elite behind the scenes manipulating world affairs for evil purposes. And the Freemasons are perfect for that. Perfect. Because not only have they got this secrecy code, but in the course of the 18th century, particularly in France, they started falling out with one another. They started arguing over whether to elect women in, or whether to elect Muslims in, or whether to elect Jews in. They argued over the right forms of rituals, the right, the values, who was in charge of the finances. And what you get is a kind of explosion of different forms of Freemasonry, different versions of rituals. Freemasons arguing with each other, even violently in some cases.
Right.
And if you're of a conspiratorial frame of mind, all of this looks like a sneaky plan. It looks like a sneaky plan to disguise the real secrets at the heart of Freemasonry, to create a sort of Russian doll effect, or an onion where you keep peeling away layers and you never quite come to the evil at the heart, which is, of course, perfect for the conspiratorial mindset because it renders it completely immune to contrary evidence. If you say, look, I know Freemasons, they're decent guys. But they're only the ones in the ordinary lodges. Wait till you speak to the guys in the higher degrees or in the occult lodges or, and so on and so forth. So it's perfect. And that's where the conspiracy theory takes hold. And it comes particularly with an Illuminati scare.
Yeah, talk about the relationship between the actual Illuminati, the Enlightenment ideals, the Freemasonry. How did that all get wrapped together, both in Europe and, of course, affecting the impression of Freemasonry in America as well?
Yeah. This is an important chapter. The Illuminati were founded in Bavaria by somebody who wanted to create a kind of not very well defined utopia, who just as it were, took seriously the potential for conspiracy that the Catholic Church, his enemy, saw, and the absolute monarchies saw in Freemasonry. He thought, oh gosh, maybe if we do have a Masonic conspiracy, we'll get where we want to go. We'll get to this utopia of free speech and enlightenment and all of that kind of stuff. So he founded the Illuminati to infiltrate Masonic lodges, and actually never quite worked out what they were trying to do. He was sort of making it up on the hoof. And for most of lots of famous people were in the Illuminati, like Goethe, but for most of them, it was just a glorified book club. It wasn't anything in particular. But of course, when it was finally discovered, because there are very rarely any secrets in this world, it terrified the living daylights out of the authorities in Bavaria and
Sure.
in the in the Catholic Church and the rest of Europe, because they thought they said, well, you see, we told you all along, here's the conspiracy. And so the Illuminati were inserted into this machinery of conspiracy mythology, became so successful that the United States had its own Illuminati scare, short-lived. But conspiracism, the fear of the Freemasons, only really took hold in the middle of the 1820s, when a Freemason in upstate New York vanished. The Morgan controversy. He had been boasting that he was a rather drunken ne'er-do-well, the kind of person the Masons are supposed to exclude. And he had been heard boasting that he was going to publish the Rituals of Freemasonry. Now, the Rituals of Freemasonry had been published, the secrets had been published many times before then. But in the very religious climate of upstate New York, we're in the second great revelation. What's it called? Second great revelation. The names escape me anyway. There was a lot of kind of religious fundamentalism, religious fervor around. The most likely explanation is that some Freemasons really took these terrible oaths that they'd taken very seriously. And in their naivety, if you like, about the real nature of Masonic secrecy, decided to do away with this guy, William Morgan, and he vanished. His body was never found.
Which reinforces public perceptions of a deep, dark conspiracy.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
This triggered a massive wave of anti-Masonry. There were suspicions also that the Masons had, fixed the various trials into the case and, and so on and so forth. And this led to this wave of anti-Masonry and the foundation of an anti-Masonic party and anti-Masons running for president and all of that kind of thing. Well, at the same time, of course, you've got Masons as presidents and so on. And Freemasonry is very, very well rooted because, George Washington had given it such a tremendous start in the United States. So that caused a kind of catastrophic dip in Masonic affiliation in the United States that really only began to revive in the kind of antebellum years.
Mm-hmm. I am fascinated that both around the time of the French Revolution and after, and in the United States, that there was this strong anti-Masonic activity, but there was an aberration to that trend, that in the area of your deepest expertise, Italy, that after Napoleon's conquests, Freemasonry actually became quasi-official in Napoleonic Italy. How did that happen? And what did it have to do with the so-called charcoal burners or carbonari?
Yeah. Italy's a very interesting case of something that was happening across Europe, particularly after the Reformation, after the Restoration. So after the upheaval of the French Revolution and Napoleon conquering large parts of Europe, we get the Battle of Waterloo, Napoleon sent off onto his island, and absolutist authority is reestablished. Now, Freemasonry comes into this picture because it had virtually died out after the French Revolution, despite what the conspiracy theorists say, that they caused the French Revolution. It didn't really work out for them if they did. But Napoleon seized on it. We don't know whether he himself was a Freemason or Josephine, but Josephine definitely was. And many of his closest clan were Freemasons. And he turned Freemasonry into a semi-official club for all of these new men and new military officers. You know, one of Napoleon's great appeals to the thrusting middle classes of France and of other countries was that, just like Napoleon, who'd risen from being a corporal to being the most powerful man in the world, you too could rise just, you know, because of your talents and not because of the status you were born into. And men like that found in Freemasonry a way to network, a way to reinforce their status, a way to meet powerful people like Napoleon's closest collaborators, and a way to show their loyalty to the regime. So Napoleon created this official Freemasonry, if you like, semi-official Freemasonry, which was also exported to many countries that Napoleon conquered, including southern Italy, where Napoleon's brother-in-law, Giochi Murat, was made king of Naples by Napoleon, and at the very same moment became Grand Master of the Grand Orient of Naples, precisely so that he could co-opt members of the Neapolitan elite who wanted to modernize their society and along Napoleonic lines into being loyal to the Napoleonic regime. So, you know, but also, of course, these local people needed to be watched. They couldn't be, I mean, they weren't French. They needed to be kept an eye on. So Napoleon's lodges were also great centers for spying and intelligence. And they were all places where Italians also began to organize with a view to uniting Italy. For the first time, Italy had never been united before, and the unification of Italy under the Napoleonic boot, if you like, opened up the idea that Italy actually might make sense as a country. So you've got this mixture of kind of spying and intelligence and counterintelligence and conspiracy going on in the Masonic lodges, and in a break-off organization called the Charcoal Burners, or the Carbonari, who turn into, having been founded by French people within the Napoleonic regime, turn into a revolutionary organization that aims to overturn the Napoleonic regime and also subsequently overturn the restored monarchies after Napoleon forms. Remember, these are absolutist monarchies, and if you're undoing politics is illegal, it's treason. So you need to do it in secret societies where you can create that sort of Russian doll effect, so that you're not easy to penetrate. You're not easy for spies to get in and and behead and find the leadership. So the Masonic organizational model lends itself superbly well to revolutionaries, to revolutionary conspiracies. So the conspiracies that the establishment had feared after the French Revolution actually come into being. It's one of the many, many historical ironies of the history of Freemasonry.
It seems to me that there's no shortage of things that Freemasonry can be blamed for, and its overlap over these centuries with any conspiracies or political movements that you want, because of the nature of the secrecy we spoke of earlier. It's a convenient boogeyman, right? So there are conspiracy theories that overlap with anti-Semitism, that because Jews were allowed into many lodges relatively early on, that in fact it's a front for the great Jewish conspiracy theory, right? Or the idea that because we don't know exactly what they teach, I think it was, fast forwarding to the 20th century, I think it was Francisco Franco in Spain who tried to equate Freemasonry and communism as the threat to his regime. So it becomes a very convenient boogeyman and gets a lot of negative attention there, but it also played a really interesting role in America in the US Civil War because of something that was called Prince Hall Freemasonry and because of the person of, I believe his name was Albert Pike, who was notorious in many ways and became the source of many of these conspiracy thinkers' ideas because of things he said and did that were a bit apart from traditional Freemasonry. Can you talk a bit about the American experience around the US Civil War and how Freemasonry really intersected with a whole lot of that history?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the many, many fascinating things about Freemasonry, and why it makes such a powerful perspective and fascinating lens to look at the world through, and particularly to look at America through. Because as I said, those values that Freemasonry espoused from the outset, those Enlightenment values, were the values of, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and so on and so forth. But in the Freemason really became a home from home once it landed in the American colonies, and as I said, particularly once after independence. But of course, just like America, its espousal of those values was stained from the outset by slavery. And Freemasonry ran into exactly the same problem. It was a microcosm of the American tragedy, if I can put it that way, in the sense that because of the racism of white American Freemasons who refused membership, this was triggered in Massachusetts, refused membership to a man called Prince Hall, an African American freeman, and some of his friends refused membership of Freemasonry. They founded their own lodge, which would ultimately gain recognition in London from the Grand Lodge of England, rather
And let
than
me cut
from
in
any
here, John, to ask, isn't
Yeah.
it true that traditionally the lodges, at least according to their constitutions and their laws, were remarkably open? They did invite people from different faiths. They did invite people from different backgrounds. They did not have explicit bans on people depending on the color of their skin. But of course, social practice in individual lodges did lead to some racism along the way.
Absolutely. In London's lodges in the 18th century, in those early years of Freemason, we find not just different varieties of Protestantism, we find Jews. We even find Catholics. Now, in
Right.
18th century London, Catholics were, pretty much traitors, regarded as traitors a priori. And yet Freemasonry even had a Catholic Grand Master in its early years. And
Amazing.
that's an astonishing modern level of tolerance. But in America, it ran up against the race problem, and it ran up against similar problems in other countries. In Germany, it ran up against deep-seated anti-Semitism, for example. In America, it took how it manifested itself was the foundation of an African American tradition of Freemasonry called after its founder, Prince Hall Freemasonry. Mm-hmm. And here we run into what we said at the outset about the Masonic ban on politics. Of course, if you're an African American and somebody says, you mustn't fight against slavery, that's doing politics, you're going to say,
right.
well, who says, We don't think that way. The definitions of politics varied, and indeed we find Prince Hall Freemasons deeply involved in the struggle against Freemasonry. The example, in the struggle against slavery. Forgive me. The example I use is the 54th Massachusetts, the famous regiment that was made the subject of the movie Glory a few years ago, which was the first regiment recruited in the North of freed African Americans, recruited into the Union forces, and to fight to end slavery. That's when 1863, when the Civil War becomes a war to end slavery. And it was recruited, and many of its junior officers, its non-commissioned officers, as we call them in the UK. Do you use that phrase, sergeants and stuff? Do you use that phrase in the USA? Were Prince Hall Freemasons. It was recruited, that regiment, by networks of Prince Hall Masons, and Prince Hall Masons were in it. Their sons were in it. So they were in the forefront. They were, if you like, the black intellectual elite on a war footing.
Right.
And a century later, we find so many Freemasons, Prince Hall Freemasons, involved in the civil rights struggle at all kinds of levels. Many of those early legal struggles, for example, Brown versus the Board of Education, were funded largely by collections by Prince Hall Masonic lodges. And just one example against many, 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 among many, was Medgar Evers, who was murdered, what would it be, 60 years ago next year. Medgar Evers was a Prince Hall Freemason. His branch of the NAACP was inside the Prince Hall Grand Lodge in Jackson, Mississippi, for its own protection. And as it happens, he was also murdered by a white supremacist Freemason. So that struggle was hugely important. And on the other side, there's no question that in certain times and places, white Freemasonry became a vehicle for white supremacist ideas. And in the person, for example, of Albert Pike, you mentioned, who is really the man. The Scottish Rite is the most, the term won't mean very much to non-Freemasons, but it's the most elaborate system and most prestigious, I suppose, system of Masonic rituals. That's where you get 33rd degree Masons, 33rd degree Masons. A 33rd degree Masons has reached the top of the ladder, the ritual ladder of the Scottish Rite. And the man who really codified those 33 rituals, or 30 extra ones to the 3 basic ones, was Albert Pike, who was a Confederate general and a white supremacist thinker who advocated, after the Civil War, the foundation of a secret society looking remarkably like Freemasonry, but not Freemasonry, because it would be political, and its goal would be, would be white supremacy, the maintaining of white dominance in the post-Civil War South.
It's cases like this, John, that when I struggle to understand conspiracy thinking, this is what I like to point to with Freemasonry. Is you had the Prince Hall Freemasons, you had some of the, in a sense, the heroes of the Civil War were strong Freemasons and were working from the principles of Freemasonry. And on the other side, you had Albert Pike, who was justifying slavery and violence against African Americans based on his interpretation of Freemasonry. And it's if you could have a similar tradition where they are literally killing each other, pretty hard to imagine a unified global conspiracy, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. The interface between there are so many ways, and I've just illustrated some of them, in which Freemasonry is both influenced by the history of the modern world and influences the history of the modern world.
Hmm.
And you have to be extraordinarily dogged in your lack of imagination to really survey this vast panorama and think it's all down to a conspiracy.
Hmm. Hmm. Let's talk about two modern examples of this. One example, I'd like to return to the United States to talk about the evolution of Freemasonry after the World War II in the United States, and then its decline actually in recent decades. So, as you know, my father recently passed away, and as I was going through his papers, I learned something which I never knew before, which is that his father, so my grandfather, was at least a third degree Mason. I don't know if he was in the Scottish Rite and proceeded, but the papers I found surprised me to learn that in fact he was a master Mason, and it makes sense because this is the time in the 1940s, 1950s when there was a boom in Freemasonry across the United States. Lodges were popping up everywhere. It seemed like, at least among white Protestant men, it was very common to join these lodges, and it became the source of a lot of fellowship, a lot of networking. It became the source of some pop culture with shows like the Flintstones cartoon, echoing this trend in American culture and providing a social bond during those crucial decades. But then, of course, it declined after that as other things started taking people away from the feeling of I must go to the lodge to be with my brethren. Talk a little bit about that evolution in the United States and whether my grandfather's experience of joining the lodge in that period was in fact representative in many ways of what was going on.
Yeah, well, having kindly read my book, you'll know that I had a very similar experience. My own grandfather, I discovered, was a Freemason.
Hmm.
He'd fought all the way through the First World War, and joined, like many millions of men from the combatant countries, joined the lodge, I think, in the hope of finding the fellowship that he'd found in the trenches. And also, maybe getting a helping hand readjusting to civilian life, because he was a professional soldier. He'd been in the army for
Mm,
10 years or so as an artilleryman.
right.
So that's a very common experience.
Hmm.
And yeah, that post Second World War peak really came as the sort of final crescendo of a century in the United States of fraternalism, golden century of fraternalism, with a bit of a dip for money reasons during the Depression. But really, and it wasn't just Freemasonry, it was lots of other organizations inspired by Freemasonry, who organizations, from the Rotary and the Lions and, all those thousands of fraternal organizations that unite, that is one of the extraordinary characteristic things about the United States, particularly in the 19th century. All of them have got Masonic DNA, basically. They are, we like this about Freemasonry, but we're just going to tweak it a bit. We don't want to have to wear all the costumes and stuff like that. So we're going to do this, or, have slightly different rules, or, so, and so you get Catholic ones forming and more working class, cheaper ones forming and all
Sure,
this sort
sure.
of thing. And that movement absolutely culminated after the Second World War, really, when, American males, almost by definition, were members of fraternal organizations. And the Freemasons were the sort of the original and best of those, if you like. The oldest, the most historically prestigious, the ones who really told their own story as walking in lockstep with the American story. They saw themselves as a symbol of freedom. They could look around the world and see that Freemasonry was banned behind the Iron Curtain and behind the Bamboo Curtain. And that, bolstered their idea that Freemasonry really stood for America, for the core of what America was about.
And John, it helps put to rest the idea that Freemasonry is a front for Bolshevism and communism, right?
Oh,
so
God,
Francisco
yes, absolutely.
the banning
absolutely.
in most communist countries of anything resembling Freemasonry puts a rest to that.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's a front for drinking beer and having meals, but that's about it. But
which is not a bad thing. We're not
yeah,
criticizing
or a front for doing charity work, whatever. No, I'm a big fan of beer and nice meals. So, the deeply, deeply, deeply ingrained in American society. This is why Buzz Aldrin founds a Masonic lodge on the moon.
Which is a story most people don't know that that actually happened, right?
Yeah, he had a license from, I think it was the Grand Lodge of Texas to found a Masonic lodge on the moon. I don't think anybody attends the meetings, but I think it's still on the books.
Not that we know of.
Yes. But that peak began to decline, and the decline is really about the broader changes in American society. One of the big ones is the growth of the financial industry, of life insurance, and that's the life insurance, because you forget that Freemasonry was a kind of welfare system. Right. You paid your contribution so that your widow would get a payout if if something happened to you. That's why it was so successful in the British Empire as the sort of informal welfare system for imperial soldiers and bureaucrats and merchants who were traveling the world and conquering large bits of it. And it's not a coincidence that lots of fraternal organizations then morphed into insurance companies with the passage of time. You also got a change in lifestyles. A lot of the 1950s, the late 1950s, was when the actual peak of Masonic membership happened. Some went over 4 million, 4.1 million, I think it was also coincided with the lowest rate of female employment. Women had gone back into the home after the Second World War. And as women emerged, became more educated, entered the workforce, they weren't going to stay at home and polish the floor while, husband went off to the lodge meeting. The other entertainment forms became available, that were, more gender mixed and required less time commitment, because Freemasonry can be very time consuming, and so for this and other reasons, mostly social drivers, Freemasonry entered this kind of decline. Famously, 14 presidents of the United States have been Freemasons. Last one was Gerald Ford. Truman was probably the most Masonic of the Masonic presidents, the one who really, he kept going to lodge meetings when he was president, and he really found something very important for his life in Freemasonry.
Do I recall correctly, John, that Harry Truman was Scottish Rite and actually reached that 33rd level?
I think you're right. Yes.
I remember hearing that at some
I
point.
mean, the 33rd degree is actually generally bestowed as a kind of honor rather than, but yes, I think you're right.
And fascinating to think in terms of presidential security that at that time things were much looser and more casual, but it's hard to
Yeah.
imagine a president in recent decades going into a Masonic lodge and having Secret Service protection
Well, yeah,
capable.
let alone the
Yeah,
damage to his image that might accrue. Can you imagine a Republican
absolutely.
president
Well, it
going
really
in?
points to the difference between what you said of the culture of the 1940s and 1950s versus the
Yeah,
culture in America today. But it's not solely an American story, right? The Masonic, there are stories all over the world, and I will encourage people to look at your book, which is The Craft, and it describes fully how Freemasons helped make the modern world. But the other conspiracy story I want to talk about is back to your area of deepest expertise, which is Italy. And I would like you to tell the story of what was awkwardly known as the Propaganda 2 Lodge, or P2, and its venerable master, and the absolute blockbuster, headline grabbing activities that occurred within and around that lodge, intersecting with huge Italian government investigations. So tell us the broad outlines of the Propaganda 2 or P2 Lodge and how that developed.
yeah. P2 is where all the conspiracy theories come true, basically. And it's an extraordinary story. Italian Freemasonry was, well, just to give you an idea of what they got up to, Licio Gelli, the venerable master of the P2 Masonic Lodge, was convicted of financing the right-wing terrorists who committed Italy's worst post-war terrorist atrocity, the murder of more than 80 people in 1980 when a bomb was placed in the waiting room of Bologna station.
Yeah.
He laundered money for the mafia. His lodge was a center of corruption and blackmail, and right-wing conspiracy, anti-democratic conspiracy. And that story really could only happen in Italy. Italian Freemasonry in the second half of the 19th century had been right at the center of the country's political life. Italy didn't have political parties then, but it had Masonic lodges. Lodges were where the meetings happened, where you talked to people, where you got your ideas across. They didn't support one side or the other, but they were a very important organizing forum when politics was an elite business. And of course, Freemasons, being great anti-Catholics, were perfectly suited to a country that had founded itself by knocking the Pope off his throne. And the Pope had excommunicated all the leaders of post-unification Italy after Garibaldi and all of that. So, after 1870, when Rome was taken over and the Pope confined to the Vatican. So the Masons felt like they were right at the center of the value system and the political system of Italy. But then along came fascism and banned Freemasonry in 1925, Mussolini's first act after he declared that he was going to found a dictatorship was to ban Freemasonry. And in post-war Italy, the Italian Republic was founded really by a collaboration between two opposing parties who would go on to dominate the post-war political settlement. The Christian Democrat Party, a Catholic party, conservative party, part of the Western Alliance,
Mm-hmm.
and the Communist Party, Europe's most powerful communist party.
Right.
which put Italy right on the front line of the Cold War. My God, if the communists took over, who in Italy, who would be next? So the Cold War was fought out in Italy, but the Freemasons felt powerless within this because both the Catholic Christian Democrats and the communists hated Freemasonry. Italy's constitution that they created in 1948, came online in 1948, banned secret societies. And, it wasn't clear whether that applied to the Freemasons or not. So in a desperate bid to get back to power, as it were, get back to the center of public life, at a time in the mid-1970s when the communists were growing electorally, when the Christian Democrats were mired in one corruption scandal after another, this man, Lucio Gelli, came along to the Grand Orient of Italy, Italy's most prestigious Masonic tradition. He said, look, you've got this thing called propaganda too, lodge propaganda. I think I can use that to help you get back where you want to be, to attract a top caliber of member to your body. Propaganda had been a lodge that was founded to allow famous people, that top statesmen, poets, celebrities, to become Freemasons without having to go through the bother of going to lodge meetings because they were too busy. So they could bring their luster to Freemasonry and while not having to commit too much time to it. So Lodge Propaganda 2, as it was rebaptized after the war when Freemasonry was refounded, Gelli said, and Gelli was a man, he was a fascist, he had been a fascist, and so I said, look, I can use this. I can bring famous people on board for you. I've got lots of great contacts. But what he did was he re-engineered P2 into this corruption machine because and took it over, made it, the cuckoo took over the nest, if you like, because Freemasonry has a lot of antibodies within it to stop it being misused. You have to swear to obey the law when you become a Freemason. You can't just take over a lodge and do what you want with it. You have to serve a long time in other duties and responsibilities, do an apprenticeship, as it were, before you might acquire any authority within the lodge as the master of the lodge, whatever. And just the sheer amount of time dedicated to rituals and meetings and so on means that if you're really looking to use a Masonic lodge as a sort of center of corruption and dodgy dealing, you're better founding a WhatsApp group. It's just a lot easier.
Right.
But Gelli did this. He used this, and the sort of mystique of Freemasonry to turn it into this corrupt power center. And when it was exposed and the secret membership list was found, it was found to contain, huge parts of the military and police establishment, huge numbers of bankers, politicians, statesmen, the man who would be Silvio Berlusconi, the man who would go on to become Prime Minister of Italy much later. And this unleashed a new wave of conspiracy thinking. How far did this go? And nobody's ever quite come up with an answer. And in the process, permanently damaged the image of Freemasonry in Italy. Nowhere in the world, I don't think, outside of the countries that ban Freemasonry, has Freemasonry got such a bad image.
Now, if you put together this picture, which is still a bit murky, it's still a bit blurry exactly where the lines of influence ended and the lines of direct control began. But when you look at this murky, blurry picture, do you think that Freemasonry was at the heart of the criminal activity, or is it closer to a description that there was criminal activity that just involved a lot of use, perhaps manipulation and co-opting of Freemasonry?
I think it was using and co-opting Freemasonry. It took advantage ruthlessly, in a very Machiavellian way, of weaknesses within Freemasonry. Both the weakness of this lodge propaganda as a sort of constitutional mechanism within
Mhm.
Freemasonry, but also, the idea that Freemasons get into Freemasonry to network, to make important friends. What Jelly did was strip out all of the, in a lot of people's perceptions, strip out all the rituals and stuff. There were no rituals in lodge propaganda too once you'd become a member. And the oath that you took was just to help your brothers. It was a kind of omertà. It was like the mafia code
Mhm.
rather than the Masonic code. So he re-engineered it. And also, there were enough powerful people out there who were just drawn by the very mystique of the idea that this was the real heart of power in Italy. And Jelly may not have ever used any of them, or they may well have done nothing wrong. But what he certainly did was spend their names to say, look, we've got so and so, we've got this general, we've got the head of this bank. And in his lodge, there were never any lodge meetings. To get to
Mhm.
do anything within lodge propaganda, you had to go through Licio Gelli. So he centralized, Freemasonry as a network. He made it into a organizational pyramid with him at the top.
That's an important point, because it seems in looking at this great history you've compiled, that the cases where Freemasonry has gone down some of those darker roads haven't been, it doesn't appear that they've been Freemasonry incidents. They've been incidents of Freemasons deviating from the general path of democratic election of leaders within the lodge, of open decision making, of fraternal relations, but a corruption of those, such as, in this case, Jelly running essentially a dictatorial version of a lodge, which, yes, it's still associated with the Masonic movement, but it is in fact not the way that most Masonic lodges run, and certainly not the way that they were intended to run as a social organization and a decision-making body.
I think that's right if you're talking exclusively about, as it were, corruption, the thing that, Masons are often suspected of, being sort of illicit influence. But I think you're wrong when it comes to some of the other flaws of Freemasonry and some of the other
Mhm.
problems that it's got into. They are to do with Freemason. They aren't to do with just individual Freemasons going wrong. There have been problems institutionally with Freemasonry. I've already cited the racism of white Freemasonry, the long history of racism in white
Right.
Freemasonry, which is only really in relatively recent years begun to come to terms with.
Mm.
Another instance is the British Empire.
Yes.
Now,
Yes.
the Freemasonry's universal values, I've already explained that the Masonic network, as it were, the Masonic welfare system, was a fundamental informal support to the British Empire. You're an imperial soldier and you could be moved from Canada to Calcutta to Cape Town. You need to find a home from home when you arrive. You need somebody who's going to send some money to your widow if you meet a nasty end. You need friends. You need something familiar. You need a social life. And the lodge provided that. And Freemasonry was proud of its association with empire, and indeed it went further. The great legitimating lie of the British Empire was that Britain was conquering the world and ruling large parts of it, not for selfish reasons, God forbid, but to bring the light of civilization to backward countries and backward peoples. And Freemasonry, that in other words, it was conquering the world in the name of universal values. And Freemasonry wedded itself to that lie wholesale, absolutely wholesale. It was proud, generation after generation of Freemasons were proud imperialists and proudly bought that lie. And many, many of the crimes of the British Empire, one or two of which I illustrate in the book, were committed by Freemasons who thoroughly believed in that bringing the light of civilization lie, that idea that Masonry's universal values were a kind of an indication of Britain's entitlement to rule large parts of the world. Freemasonry Britain had given the world Freemasonry, and that was a sign of its mission, if you like. And British Freemasons simply have not come to terms with that legacy. I think Freemasons, one of the very interesting things about studying Freemasonry as a historian is that this is an organization that has historians in it, that it's very proud of its traditions, that has specialist lodges of historians. Masons, it's almost part and parcel of being a Freemason, that of studying the history of Freemasonry. But those histories of Freemasonry have been apologetic overwhelmingly, those histories written by Freemasons, when it comes to the British Empire. They have not come to terms with the racist enterprise that the British Empire was.
Well, let me close on the Freemasonry conspiracy topic by simply asking you, do you have any reason to believe that things like the Kennedy assassination, the 9/11 attacks in America, and other such events, which are often in those dark recesses of the internet linked with Freemasonry, you found a real conspiracy linked to Freemasonry in modern Italy, but do you have a sense that those other events have any legitimate link to Freemasonry as an organization?
None whatsoever. I'm glad you brought up Dan Brown before.
Yes.
Because the Lost Symbol, which was his sequel, of course, to the Da Vinci Code. And
Right.
the Da Vinci Code caused all sorts of problems for the Catholic Church when it came out. They thought they were going to be, basically had a lot of nutcases banging on their doors saying, tell us the secret. And the Freemasons, when they heard that the next book was going to be about the Lost Symbol, was going to be about Freemasonry, were terrified that they were going to, it was going to unleash a new wave of conspiracy theories. But the smart thing that Dan Brown did, and I'm probably the only academic who will speak up for Dan Brown, but I really like that book. The smart thing that he did was, it's basically, I hope this isn't a spoiler, it's basically the bad guy who is the only one who believes that the Masons are really powerful and have, and he's bonkers, he's nuts.
Yeah.
And so in other words, it's a book that a kind of Shaggy Dog story where we're led to believe there's a great Masonic secret at the end, but actually what it is, it's the ravings of a homicidal madman who is the bad guy, and the Masons are just decent chaps.
Right.
So I think, I'm with Dan Brown on this, in that there is, there's no truth in these Masonic conspiracies. Like I said, Freemasonry has been powerful, often in spite of itself, in giving birth to conspiracy thinking. Its organizational model, this idea of a brotherhood bound together by a sense of secrecy, bound together by rituals, where you join a local cell of the organization, but that gives you access to a much wider network. That organizational model has been extraordinarily successful. Loads of other organizations have plagiarized it, copied it. Nothing, not the Masons' fault, but the Sicilian mafia is a plagiarized copy of the Freemasons. Many Sicilian mafiosi, if they turn state's evidence and you ask them, well, what's the mafia then? They say, well, we're kind of like a Freemasons for murderers and killers and criminals. And they're absolutely right. They're absolutely right. Obviously, the ethical purposes are very, very different, light years apart. But in terms of both the historical origins of the Sicilian mafia and in terms of its organizational template, they're absolutely right. So the Masonic history is in part about the unconscious influence, the inadvertent influence of the Masonic model and of the fear of Freemasonry on world history.
John, we close our episodes here on Chatter by pulling out a random pre-printed question from this, our chatter box, as we call it. So I'm going to surprise you with this. Who is someone in your field or a related one whose work more people should be following?
Well, there's a very good book, I think, as a historian, my main interest in is the history. And if you want to know the history, a fuller history of American Freemasonry, there's a book called American Freemasons. Subtitle is something like 3 Centuries of Building Communities by someone called Mark Tabbert. And I that's a book I greatly admired because it's one of the first histories of Freemasonry in America that is very inclusive, that systematically includes both African American and mainstream traditions, both Prince Hall Freemasonry and mainstream white Freemasonry, to give an overall picture. Too many of them take a sort of a priori decision. And that's a really nice book that I draw on quite heavily, that American readers, I think, would like.
And I believe it was Mark Tabbert who also wrote the book that was entirely about George Washington's experience as a Freemason and his involvement in the lodge. So probably a great place. We'll put those in the show notes so other people can benefit from that research and writing as well. John, this has been extremely enjoyable for me and I hope intriguing for everyone. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. I've enjoyed it enormously.
That was Chatter, a production of Lawfare and Goat Rodeo. Please subscribe to the podcast and find us on Twitter at ThatWasChatter.